Yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Durham, just so people remember what this is all about, let me ask you, the Mueller investigation revealed that Russia interfered in the 2016 election in sweeping and systemic fashion, correct?
That's correct.
And Russia did so through a social media campaign that favored Donald Trump and disparaged Hillary Clinton, correct?
As the report says, yes.
And Mueller found that a Russian intelligence service hacked computers associated with the Clinton campaign and then released the stolen documents publicly. Is that right?
That report speaks for itself as well.
Mueller also reported that though he could not establish the crime of conspiracy beyond a reasonable doubt, he also said, quote, a statement that the investigation did not establish certain facts does not mean there was no evidence of those facts. That also appears in the report, doesn't it?
There's language to that effect, yes.
In fact, you cited that very statement in your own report, did you not, as a way of distinguishing between proof beyond a reasonable doubt and evidence that falls short of proof beyond a reasonable doubt?
Correct.
As an illustration of this, both Mueller and congressional investigations found that Trump's campaign chairman, Paul Manafort, was secretly meeting with an operative linked to Russian intelligence named Konstantin Kilimnik, correct?
That's my understanding, yes.
And that Manafort, while chairman of the Trump campaign, gave that Russian intelligence operative the campaign's internal polling data, correct?
That's what I've read in the news, yes.
And that Manafort provided this information to Russian intelligence while Russian intelligence was engaged in that social media campaign and the release of stolen documents to help the Trump campaign, correct?
You may be getting beyond depth of my knowledge, but
well, let me say very simply, while Manafort, the campaign chairman for Donald Trump, was giving this Russian intelligence officer internal campaign polling data, Russian intelligence was helping the Trump campaign, weren't they?
I don't know that.
You really don't know those
right.
very basic facts of the investigation?
I know the general facts, yes. Do I know that particular fact myself? No. I mean, I know that I've read that in the media.
And are you aware, Mr. Durham, that Mueller and congressional investigations also revealed that Don Jr. was informed that a Russian official was offering the Trump campaign, quote, very high level and sensitive information, unquote, that would be incriminating if Hillary Clinton was part of, quote, Russia and its government support of Mr. Trump? Are you aware of that?
Sure, people get phone calls all the time from individuals who claim to have information like that.
Really, the son of a presidential candidate gets calls all the time from foreign government offering dirt on their opponent? Is that what you're saying?
I don't think this is unique in your experience.
So you have other instances of the Russian government offering dirt on a presidential candidate to the presidential candidate's son. Is that what you're saying?
Would you repeat the question?
You said that it's not uncommon to get offers of help from a hostile foreign government in a presidential campaign directed at the president's son. You really stand by that, Mr. Durham?
I'm saying that people can make phone calls making claims all the time that you may have experienced.
Are you really trying to diminish the significance of what happened here and the secret meeting that the president's son set up in Trump Tower to receive that incriminating information, trying to diminish the significance of that, Mr. Durham?
I'm not trying to diminish it at all, but I think the more complete story is that they met and it was a ruse and they didn't talk about Mrs. Clinton.
And you think it's insignificant that he had a secret meeting with a Russian delegation for the purpose of getting dirt on Hillary Clinton, and the only disappointment expressed in that meeting was that the dirt they got wasn't better. You don't think that's significant?
I don't think that was a well-advised thing to do.
Not well-advised.
Right.
Wow, that's the understatement of the year. So you think it's perfectly appropriate or maybe just ill-advised for a presidential campaign to secretly meet with a Russian delegation to get dirt on their opponent? You would merely say that's inadvisable?
Yeah, if you're asking me would I do it, I hope I wouldn't do it. But it was not illegal. It was stupid, foolish, ill-advised.
Well, it is illegal to conspire to get incriminating opposition research from a hostile government that is of financial value to a campaign. Wouldn't that violate campaign laws?
I don't know all those facts to be true.
Well, your report, Mr. Durham, doesn't dispute anything Mueller found, did it?
No, our object, our aim was not to dispute Director Mueller. I have the greatest regard, highest regard for Director Mueller. He's a patriot.
The only distinguishment between his investigation and yours is he refused to bring charges where he couldn't prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt, and you did. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Colorado is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Durham, I want to, as a fellow alum of DOJ, I want to thank you for your service, number one. And number two, welcome you to Congress.
It's a real pleasure to be here.
I want to ask you some questions about FISA and some of your most recent experiences as the special counsel and what your specific advice would be, I guess. I am concerned with the conclusions in your report, and I just want to, they've been mentioned several times here, but in your opening statement, you talk about lack of investigative discipline, a failure to take logical investigative steps, and bias. It appears to me that the lack of investigative discipline and the failure to take logical investigative steps are a result of bias. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. When you look at what is involved here, this is a presidential campaign. It's not a run-of-the-mill investigation. This is so highly sensitive. It could affect the outcome of a presidential election and the future of the nation. You would expect that the discipline that would have been followed would have been higher than ever. And that didn't happen here. There was sort of analytical rigor, the discipline and how we investigate criminal matters, that was just absent here in large measure.
Fair to say that there was a rush to judgment?
I'm sorry?
Fair to say that there was a rush to judgment? In other words, the judgment of proceeding with the investigation before following proper procedure?
It's been alluded to here. The information that they had received from the Australian diplomats, not Australian intelligence or law enforcement, about Australian diplomats about something that was said at a bar. Within 3 days of that information having been received at FBI headquarters, the deputy director of the FBI, according to Mr. Strzok, told him to immediately open that, and it was opened as a full investigation on a weekend with Mr. Strzok, not only writing the opening electronic communication, the opening memo, but approving that memo as well.
And this is the same Mr. Strzok who we saw the text message from that had a clear bias regarding President Trump.
It's the same person, yes.
And how long did Director Comey serve in the FBI before he became director? And I'm not saying Department of Justice, I'm saying FBI.
Right. To my knowledge, he was not in the FBI prior to becoming director.
And he promoted the people, Andy McCabe, Peter Strzok, others, to the position in headquarters and then dealt with them there. Is that fair?
He would have certainly had a role in the advancement of people in the upper management of the FBI, yes.
My concern is that the bias that has been demonstrated there, whether it has been eradicated or dealt with, could exist in any of these agencies. And these agencies have access to very sensitive information that we and Congress allow for counterterrorism, counterintelligence activities. And it really goes around the Constitution because it does not deal with U.S. citizens. And I'm talking about the FISA rules now. Have you heard of backdoor searches?
I've heard the term, yes, sir.
And it refers to the ability of an agency to look at a U.S. citizen's communications because the communication was with a foreign individual and it was recorded because that foreign individual was being looked at. Is that fair?
That's fair.
And if there was this bias in an agency like the FBI that we saw previously, and they wanted to go after a U.S. citizen, they could use that technique to go after that citizen. And my question to you is, how do we prevent that? How do we in Congress take a look at FISA, try to maintain the national security interests, but at the same time protect U.S. citizens from a rogue agency, a biased agency or agent? I shouldn't say agency and condemn everyone, but individuals in the agency. How do we protect American citizens from what could occur? And let me give you another quick example. Going out and buying information from private data sellers to obtain information that you couldn't obtain with a search warrant because you don't have probable cause. Those techniques are all available under FISA. What should we do?
You know, that's clearly beyond my my background and experience. These are very complicated questions, particularly when we know the adversaries are doing the same thing. And, you know, what do we do under those circumstances? I think you've got a very tough job in figuring out how do you balance the liberties of the American people, protect the liberties of the American people, while at the same time protecting the country and the nation and the people of the United States. I don't feel qualified really to provide you with any helpful information along those lines, but I know that it is a serious issue. It's a serious concern.
I thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Before going to the gentleman from California, the gentlelady from Texas has a unanimous consent, I think? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent to submit records from the Department of Justice reflecting meetings with the U.S. Attorney John Durham. These records were in response to American Oversight's request for DOJ communications between the offices of the Attorney General and the Deputy Attorney General and the Durham or his first assistant. I ask unanimous consent to place this in the record of this hearing.
Without objection, so ordered.
Mr. Chairman, I have a unanimous consent.
Gentleman from California.
Mr. Chairman, you and your colleagues have continually cited to Steve DeUnio's transcribed interviews using selected statements taken out of context. I move for unanimous consent to enter the entire transcript into the record so the American public can see for itself exactly what he said.
Yeah, we will work on that. Yeah, we'll work on that. We don't want to. We'll talk with the chairman. We want to make that fully available.
Mr. Chairman, you're objecting to a unanimous consent request then to some.
Mr. Chairman, I object.
Okay.
So, if I understand correctly, Mr. Chairman, you're happy to cite selected portions of the transcript out of context, but you're not happy to see.
Mr. Chairman, there's an objection. Is there further action?
You don't want the American public to see this, Mr. Ison?
Roll call vote, please.
Yeah.
There's no vote on that.
I just want to clarify for the gentleman. We want to put the transcript out. There's a couple. We got a little work to do on certain names that have to be redacted for obvious reasons. But yeah, we definitely want to put the transcript out. We'll work with the minority to make sure that happens. I thought it was an amazing interview by Mr. D'Antuono, the former head of the Washington Field Office. We want that information out to the public, and we'll make sure it happens.
Can I suggest, Mr. Chairman, that you grant the request subject to redactions to protect personally private information?
So, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you very much.
Gentleman from California is
and you have accepted my submission. I didn't hear
that right away.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from California is recognized.
Mr. Durham, many of my MAGA colleagues want you to be someone who you are not and to say something that you clearly won't. And so I want to just start by thanking you for your many years of service to our country as a federal prosecutor. I want to talk a little bit more about the independence of a special counsel and just clarify, you did send multiple texts to the Attorney General after you were appointed as special counsel. Did you ever text message with Attorney General Garland once he took over as Attorney General?
No, Attorney General Garland had me communicate through the principal Deputy Attorney General, Mr. Weinsheimer.
Did you ever travel overseas with Attorney General Garland?
No.
And
I met with the Attorney General, but I didn't travel overseas with him.
And President Biden, through the Attorney General, could have had you removed, fired. Is that right?
I'm sure he could have.
And you stayed on?
I completed my term as special counsel.
Was there anyone you wanted to indict that you were prohibited from indicting by Attorney General Garland?
No.
So if you wanted to, you could have indicted Hillary Clinton, but you never asked. Is that right?
If I had the evidence, yeah, he could have, for sure.
If you wanted to indict President Biden, you could have asked, right?
Yeah, that was not part of our mission. We weren't really looking at that. But
if you could have indicted Director Comey, you could have asked. Is that right? And you didn't.
Yeah, the Attorney General Garland had never asked me not to indict somebody.
Great. So I just want to make it clear to my colleagues, you had all the power in the world to indict anyone that you had evidence to indict, and you were never blocked from doing it. That's correct?
That's correct.
I also want to compare you to the last major special counsel investigation that we had. You agree Special Counsel Mueller charged dozens of individuals and you indicted 3. Is that correct?
Indicted 2 and a third pleaded guilty.
Right. And Special Counsel Mueller had dozens of convictions, some at trial, but no defendant was outright acquitted. Is that right in the Mueller investigation? Outright acquitted. Across the board, every charge acquitted.
Right. I don't believe there are any acquittals. I'm not sure there were dozens of convictions. There were dozens of, more than a dozen people who were indicted.
You were wise earlier to not weigh in on Donald Trump's character. You are under oath, after all. But did anything in your report prove false that Russians met with Trump's family during the campaign at Trump Tower after an offer of dirt on Hillary Clinton? Anything prove that that meeting didn't happen?
I don't have any evidence that that did not happen.
Anything in your report prove false that in the 2016 campaign, Donald Trump tried and concealed from the public a real estate deal he was seeking in Moscow?
I don't know anything about that. There's nothing in the report about it. It's not something we investigated.
Anything in your report prove false that Donald Trump publicly asked Russia to hack Hillary's emails and then hours later they did?
If you're referring to...
Did Donald Trump not say at a press conference, Russia, if you're listening, you should get Hillary's emails? Did you prove that he didn't say that?
Yeah, no, we didn't.
Okay.
We didn't investigate.
Did you prove false in the 2016 campaign that Trump's campaign manager gave polling data to a spy for a Russian intelligence service?
We didn't investigate that.
Anything in your report say that Donald Trump in 2016 acted the way that Americans would want a presidential candidate to act with regard to Russia?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Are you signing off on the way Donald Trump acted with Russia in 2016?
Yeah, our report doesn't address that.
And you agree that Russia interfered in the 2016 election?
I agree that there's substantial evidence to show that.
Thank you. Mr. Durham, my MAGA colleagues want you to be someone you're not, and they want you to say something you won't. They want you to join the law firm of Insurrection LLC, which incidentally and probably appropriately is chaired by a guy who never passed the bar exam, and you're wise not to do that. You see, my colleagues today, they are making themselves footnotes and foot soldiers in the history books that will chronicle Donald Trump's corruption. And I yield my remaining time to Mr. Schiff.
Mr. Durham, returning to your decision to speak out during the pendency of your investigation, did you have staff on your team advise you against making statements during the pendency of your investigation?
They didn't advise me either way, no.
Did any of your staff raise ethical concerns about your speaking out either in an interim report or after the Inspector General investigation? Any of your staff raise ethical concerns with your doing so?
Not that I recall, no. Raise a technical concern? No, not that I'm aware of.
Did they raise concerns with your speaking out during the pendency of the investigation?
Time of the gentleman has expired. The witness can respond.
I'm sorry.
Did any of your staff raise concerns about your speaking out during the pendency of your investigation in contrast to DOJ policy?
Not that I recall.
Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. Gentlelady from Florida is recognized.
Good morning, Mr.
Can I
Durham.
just complete that answer, Lauren? But I don't want to lay any blame at their part. I made that decision to make a statement. They were not involved in it. Nora Danahy.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Right. Nora Danahy, a friend of mine, a very good lawyer, an honest person.
Why did she resign?
That's Nora Danahy. That's why we brought her on.
Why did she resign?
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman
Answer the question if you'd like.
Mr. Chairman, who's in charge here? Because it's not Mr. Schiff, I don't think.
It's the lady's time from Florida.
Good morning, Mr. Durham.
Good morning.
As a former federal prosecutor, I want to begin by telling you how much I appreciate your work, that of your team, and your presence here today. And you may begin by answering the prior question if you wish.
With respect to Ms. Danahy, I have the greatest respect for her. She's a friend of mine. She's very well educated. She's an honest person. We had some disagreements on issues, and I don't really have any comment beyond that. I'm not going to discuss the internal management and decision-making. I'll tell you this, that every agent and every lawyer who worked on this project had a full voice in the decisions that were going forward. I made the final decisions.
Thank you, Mr. Durham. I'd like to focus on the Department of Justice's procedures as to FISA applications when that process is conducted appropriately. To begin with, FISA surveillance application must include an affidavit from a federal law enforcement officer, correct?
That's correct.
And that affidavit must demonstrate cause to believe that the target of the surveillance is an agent of a foreign power. Is that also right?
Right. If it relates to a U.S. citizen, it has to be that they're a knowing agent. If it's a non-U.S. person, a knowing element is not required.
And it is intended that that affidavit should rely upon reasonable, trustworthy information, is it not?
That's correct.
Right. And in some cases, and including the case of Carter Page, those affidavits, that information can include the use of information obtained from a confidential human source, correct?
That's correct.
And when information from a confidential human source is included, would you agree that it's important that material related to the reliability or trustworthiness of that confidential human source is disclosed within the affidavit?
Yes.
And I believe you testified here earlier today that in this case, information in that Carter Page application related to the reliability and credibility of the confidential human source was not included in these applications. Is that right?
I believe that's correct.
Okay. Would you tell us, in your experience, in your many years working with the department, why is it important that that type of information is included and disclosed to both federal prosecutors and to the court?
There's when matters are submitted to the court, it's for a reason, or to a judge. It's to let an independent judicial officer weigh the question as to whether probable cause exists or not. In providing that information to independent, objective judicial officers, judicial magistrates, if there's confidential human source information that's being provided, it's important for the person, the judge who's reviewing this, to know what's the basis of the person's knowledge. Is it hearsay, or do they have personal knowledge, as an example? And then whether or not there's some track record or basis to believe that the information would be credible coming from this person.
And of course, at this stage of the proceeding, the person who's the subject of the investigation has no idea that this application is even being made or considered or reviewed by the court in most cases. So
That's
it's
correct.
solely rests with the government, the responsibility to ensure that this power, that this surveillance power that's being used is being done in a way that is appropriate and compliant with the law.
That's correct.
And you mentioned something earlier about that in this case, agents immediately moved to the most intrusive investigative means that were available, referring, of course, to the interception of live communications, correct?
That's correct. In this instance, the Bureau almost immediately, when they opened it as full investigations, it was the umbrella case, Crossfire Hurricane, and then the 4 sub-files, they immediately went to try to get FISA coverage on Papadopoulos, which they weren't able to do, and then Carter Page.
And some of the techniques for law enforcement, there are a myriad of other things they can do to collect surveillance information short of this interception of communications, like poll cameras, pen registers, trap and trace, trash pulls, correct? There are many other things that in investigations are often utilized prior to taking this step of attempting to intercept live communications.
Right. Those are typically building blocks for electronic surveillance.
So based on your testimony so far, what we're hearing is that here, a FISA application was pursued without disclosing some relevant information to prosecutors or the court, without following standard procedural rules, utilizing investigative techniques that were the most intrusive without first exhausting other techniques, and instead pursuing the most invasive method possible from the outset against Mr. Page.
That's essentially correct, yes.
Now, one other thing, you mentioned earlier during your testimony that the failures identified during your investigation, that if they were not addressed, they would result in national security risks and continued public lack of confidence in our institutions of justice, that there were no overnight fixes, but we needed accountability, standards, and consequences. Would you elaborate, please?
Time the gentlelady has expired. The witness can respond.
Yeah. the national security interests here include liberties of the American people. One of the things that was most disturbing about the dossier, the Steele dossier, is whether or not this is, so at least some of it was Russian disinformation. Whether Igor Danchenko, who personally wrote that he was responsible for 80% of the intelligence in the dossier and 50% of the analysis, whether or not Mr. Danchenko was the source of Russian disinformation. If you don't run some of those things to the ground, it does affect the liberties, or potentially affects the liberties of the American people and the national security interests of this country.